Welcome, Army fans. This is Joe Iacano with a very special edition to GoBlackKnights.com podcast. Honored to have two great guests with us today. Mike Buddy, Athletic Director at the United States Military Academy, who's been here multiple times. Thanks for coming back, Mike. How are things this week up at the Academy?
Wonderful. It's nice to be 9-0 and have a bye week.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I talked to Coach Monken about that yesterday at a press conference. Definitely needed the bye week. And we have first time guest, but definitely a guy with a lot of knowledge and background in the college football landscape, Kennington Smith. Kennington is his background. He's worked with the Athletic, which is a national publication. Covered the Big Ten with the Iowa Hawkeyes, actually, and a multi-time award winner in feature writing, enterprise reporting, podcasting. Maybe most importantly for me, a UGA grad, so go Dogs. So that's exciting. And currently is the Alabama beat writer and a SEC at-large reporter. And Kennington's got a ton of experience working with a lot of really high-power football schools and P5 schools. Kennington, thanks for joining us today. Understand you're down at Mercer. How's your week going?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Everything's all good here in Mercer, doing a profile on their team because they're playing Alabama this weekend. And like Mike said, it's nice to be 9-0 and on a bye week. I guess on the Georgia side, it's not so nice to be 7-2 and on the outside looking in of the playoffs. So it's that time of year, like big key games coming up, a lot of things in the mix. Signing day is coming up. So I feel like this conversation that we're going to have is really relevant to the national landscape, and I'm looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Good news is the Dogs are favored over Tennessee, I believe, this week. So tough game though. So it's interesting with the logjam at the top of the SEC. So, I'll start with you, Kennington. And I'll break them down. The two topics we're going to cover today are NIL and transfer portal. People like to lump them together, but they are really two separate things that both have different impacts, I think, on the college football and college sports landscape in its entirety. And so let's start really with the transfer portal before we get into NIL. And talking about the portal, how have you seen that impact the P5 schools that you've covered, Iowa, Alabama, Georgia, some of the other SEC schools? And then, you have an opponent that you're covering this week in Mercer, who's a lot smaller school. How has the portal kind of affected those schools as well?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different tangents that we could go off of when you talk about the transfer portal and the schools that you just named. I think from the first level of competitiveness in the sport, it's allowed for programs like Alabama and Iowa to plug holes in their roster where they need it. I think at the highest level, the most successful programs are ones that recruit out of high school and then supplement from the transfer portal. So you might have a ready-made team, but you might have a deficiency at quarterback or running back or edge rusher. You can go into the transfer portal and get a proven college-ready player, insert him into what you're doing, and then you're able to roll. I think in other aspects, it's allowed for coaches to turn over their rosters really quickly and be able to be competitive really quickly. You look at what Deion Sanders is doing at Colorado, what Lane Kiffin is doing at Ole Miss. You're able to bring in 20, 25 guys into your program, immediate influx of talent, and you're able to change the trajectory and the ceiling of your program from one year to another. So I think from those aspects is very helpful. I think in other aspects, if you're looking at a program like Alabama, it can be hurtful from the standpoint of players want to play, obviously. So you have high level players who are able to start at other Power Five schools or Group of Five schools or FCS schools, and they're having to wait their turn at Alabama. Well, now they don't have to wait their turn anymore because they can leave and go to another school and be an impact player and be a starter. So it's hurting the depth at major power schools like at Alabama or Georgia or Ohio State, where and 5, 10 years ago, you might have five-star running backs, and now you might only have one or two 5-star running backs, and you're having to supplement, you're having to develop, you're having to maybe count on walk-on players or lower rated guys to provide depth in case of injury. So there's give and take and everything. And what you just mentioned with Mercer, they're probably in maybe the most least advantageous place in this because from their perspective, you can find a diamond in the rough and he can turn into a really great player. And then he doesn't end his career in your program because he can transfer up to a Power Five school. So, in some ways, looking at this game on Saturday, it's an opportunity for the Mercer players to show what they can do for NFL scouts or prove they could play on that level. In some ways, it might be an audition. If somebody on Mercer's team really plays well and has an impact game against Alabama, maybe Alabama won't call him, but another school in Group of Five or Division 1 might take a notice to him and pluck him from that roster. So there's give and take. There's positives and negatives. I think it's hurting and helping, each school in their own way. But I think the biggest thing is that it's allowed for player mobility. That's probably the biggest aspect of all of this is the players now feel and have power to take a little bit more control over their college experience. So it's allowed for everybody to adjust. And we're so new to this. I think it's hard to determine, whether it's helpful, whether it's hurtful, exactly how to utilize it in the right way. But the schools that are adapting to it the best are finding the most success.
And just a follow up on that, because you mentioned schools who are using it in different ways, right? I think you have all different kinds of schools that I've seen. Clemson, who really tends to stay away from it, as an example. That really doesn't fit Dabo's philosophy and the culture he's trying to build at Clemson. Then you have, like you said, the plug and play kind of where it's almost like a free agent type situation where Bama may have a pretty stacked roster, but they need one or two guys to fill in the gaps. And then you have the wholesale transfer portal schools. Some of them it's worked out really well. You mentioned Colorado, you mentioned Ole Miss. Um, but then there's other cases like Florida State where, okay, it might have worked great last year, but this year, not so hot. In your opinion, to build a successful long-term program, because there's a difference between good teams and good programs. And Alabama, probably no better program in college football over the last 20 years. Great programs win multiple championships. What do you think is the right formula for building a good program long term? And then
Yeah.
Mike, kind of formulate your answer because I'm going to come back to you with the same question, actually.
Yeah, I think it just kind of depends on where your program is at and what the ceiling is. If you want to compete for national championships, I feel like the lifeblood is high school recruiting, and then you supplement with the transfer portal. You referenced Florida State, for example. They were able to build one really great team through the transfer portal, but first round picks like Jared Verse and Keon Coleman are not coming out of the portal every single year. So you need to be able to identify high level high school talent, develop it, and then in an off year where you might need a piece here and there, then you can supplement it in. So I feel like that is the best way to do it. If you're a program like Colorado, where they're probably not a perennial national championship contender, but they can be viable and have winning records and play in bowl games and in some years compete for the playoffs, if you can target 10 to 15 very solid high school players and then fill the rest in the portal, that is, I think, a good talent acquisition model as well. But if we're talking about at the highest level of the sport, I feel like it's rooted in high school recruiting and then filling in those gaps when you see fit.
Yeah, and Mike, obviously, Army, you're in a unique situation where we really have no incoming transfers. We do lose kids to the portal. Uh, Not a lot, but we've lost a few. But just take your Army AD hat off for a minute and say you're the AD at XYZ University. What do you think is probably the best way to use the portal to build a program long term, or to not use it?
Well, I think Kennington's exactly right. I mean, one of the first things you said was plug in, and I think the teams that are being successful are building a culture through high school recruiting. Which when you're recruiting high school kids, you know their coach, you talk to their parents, you talk to their pastor, you watch them play multiple times, you talk to them for multiple times. And I think where some of these people are getting into trouble is you fall in love with the portal and you're like, I like the 40 time, I like the film, I'm taking them. And what we've seen at our level, Joe, with the group of five, some of whom have 30, 40 plus transfers, the kids that are playing well at Mercer that get film and they get the opportunity, they work their tails off. Like those usually end up pretty well. I think what some of the group of five rosters are finding out is there's a reason that these kids didn't stick in the ACC or the SEC or the Big Ten. And it's usually not talent. It's a work ethic thing. It's a teammate thing. It's a locker room thing. It's an academic thing. And sometimes you're taking these kids out of the portal in a hurry because there's all kinds of people after them. And you don't get to do what you do in high school, which is get to know them, find out where their passion is, find out if they're a good fit in the locker room. And you asked a good question, Joe, which was how do you build a team? A lot of teams are just trying to assemble a team. I need a tight end, I need a wide receiver, I need a linebacker. The ones who are really succeeding still understand you have to build that team. They have to fit your culture from a character perspective, from an attitude perspective. And that's harder to do when the recruiting cycle is, 3 days in the transfer portal. And if you don't get them, your rival's going to get them. And you're tempted to just grab kids and then they don't necessarily pan out, or they make you physically better, but competitively worse.
And Mike, as a follow-on to that, you talked about culture and fit and development, and that really speaks to the program at Army, and what Coach Monken has tried to build there, and what they're really seeing a lot of success with this year. It's funny when the NIL and the portal came out, a lot of Academy football fans that we talk to on GoBlackKnights.com all the time, obviously, there was a lot of weeping and gnashing of teeth, let's just say. It was not exciting. A lot of people were like, gosh, this is going to bury Academy football. And a funny thing happened on the way to the college football playoff. And all of a sudden, it's like, okay, maybe there is something to recruiting kids out of high school and knowing if they're the right culture and fit and developing them through a strength and conditioning program and getting them to play in the same offense or same defense for 4 or 5 years. And you just look at the Army North Texas game last week. The North Texas quarterback's a stud. That Chandler Morris kid is awesome. And Nate Woody's defense held him to 3 points with 11 kids who have been in the Army program and been in Nate Woody's defense for 4 or 5 years now and understand what it takes to slow down an offense like North Texas. And they were able to hold them to a season low of 3 points. So, I always go back to, of course, I'm a Duke basketball fan, Coach K, West Point grad, company E3, just like me. And I remember when Duke played Butler in the national championship a number of years ago, and Duke had all these one and done superstars that were a part of that team, and Butler was a rim out away at the buzzer from upsetting them with a bunch of fourth year seniors who had been developed through that program. So, Mike, talk about the case for developing kids for 4 years and building maybe something that's it's a little bit of an intangible. You're not going to be able to see it right, Kennington, on a player evaluation sheet. It's not a 40 time, it's not a bench press, but culture. And you talked about how much we're seeing that with some of the G5 opponents that are loaded with transfers. How much of an advantage, maybe you can't put a point value on it, but how much of an advantage does having that type of culture give a team like Army or the other academy in Maryland?
Well, I mean, inches matter. The way we play, inches matter and seconds matter. And so what I love about the team that we've been able to assemble and develop is most of them played on the scout team for at least one full year, if not two. It's really hard if you recruit five-star talent. They don't want to sit on the bench, and their gifts are too good to have sit on the bench. What we're able to do, and certainly we wish that we could recruit 4 and 5 star kids, but we can't. And so kids come in here, they need to put on 30 pounds. They need to lift weights like a Division I football player has to lift weights. They spend their entire freshman year emulating opposing teams' offenses and defenses, developing relationships, crawling through mud, cleaning latrines, all the things that kids in the Army do. And then they've paid their dues and they've grown up and they've matured physically, emotionally. They understand the system, and then they start as juniors and seniors. And it's hard for a group of 5 roster to get old together because the best players are going to get plucked and some of the other disgruntled players are going to leave. And to your point, Joe, we don't have it. And so we have these same group of guys that go through 4 years together. And there's something to be said for that. Again, when we play Notre Dame, like you'll see it, you saw it against Navy. Every dude on that team is going to be 7 inches taller than every guy on our team and give away 40 to 50 pounds. There's a physical difference. But what we hope that we can make up for it is cohesion, gritty, tough, disciplined football and, play keep away. And so that'll be the challenge. But I think that's why we're having a lot of our success.
Absolutely. And Kennington, covering Alabama, Coach Saban has not been shy about voicing kind of his some of his concerns and some of the reasons why he left being kind of the new culture in college football around the portal and NIL and he's made plenty of statements around some of that stuff. Do you see any kind of a challenge with some of the big P5 schools that you cover around trying to fit kids into your system in 1 year and teach them really how to excel in that system? And then, even maybe just as important or more important, how to build a culture in the locker room around that?
Yeah, I think there are there. To Mike's point earlier about the transfer portal window, how short it is. You might only have the kid on campus. You might not be able to vet him properly. You might not be able to make the calls to, let's say, his high school coach or his former coaches at whatever school that he may be at. We know what this kid's name is. His stats look good on paper on campus tomorrow. See if we can get him to commit because if a couple days pass, he's on to the next school, potentially our rival, and then we're gonna be out of a high level player. So in that aspect, you're roulette. You might get a kid who's going to be able to assimilate into the culture really well and be an impact player. You might get somebody that you get on campus, and Mike said it earlier, find out why exactly it didn't work out at insert big school here. A challenge there. There is some risk involved there when it comes to locker room dynamics. There's something about players who have been on your that play this specific position, and now you're bringing in somebody from another same position, probably paying them a high dollar amount in NIL, and they're going to come in and be a prominent player, be a star on the team. How does that affect room culture when you're preaching process and program and being, a good soldier for lack of and really buying in, but then in that same turn, you're going out and outsourcing that position for somebody else who hasn't had and now they're coming in expected to be a high level player and a highly paid player on the roster. So there are some challenges there. It's really just kind of on the coach try to establish a good leadership and let everybody know that decisions that they're making are for the betterment of the team and the players are going to have. So there is a trust factor there. I think the trust is huge in the recruiting process. Is Trust is probably bigger than ever when you're talking about bringing in new players into the mix and adding them into what you've established. And I think some of that is in high school as well. NIL conversation. Now there are going to be 17, 18-year-old kids coming into your roster, making more than a 22-year-old senior or somebody who's going to be coming in at 17, 18, expecting to play and be a main fixture on the team and have a lot of media attention. How is that going to affect room dynamics? So there are some challenges there. And just off of what Mike said in his last point, and what you said as well, Joe, at the start of this NIL transfer portal, there was maybe apprehension from Army fans about where they stand in the. I think as we're getting further along into it, you're people across the sport, fans that are kind of for more of like the old school style of football where there wasn't so much player mobility and there on players getting paid and that being the main thing. And in that turn, Army is kind of now the poster child of more of the traditional, not investing so much in NIL, not having the kids that we recruited. We're developing through the program. These are 4 and 5 year guys. You know their names. They're not here today, gone tomorrow, and we're working towards something. I think it's kind of culminated in this 9-0 start. And hopefully there's more success in the future for the program. So it might be seen as a disadvantage in some areas, but I think there's an opportunity to lean into a lane that is starting to die a bit in college athletics, and Army can kind of stay in that lane, dominate that lane, and maybe garner a little bit more attention from a casual watcher or maybe somebody who doesn't want to be as much tapped into these intricacies of college football and just want to kind of watch and enjoy college football for the tradition and the pageantry that it is.
I think those are some really good points, Kennington, and I think that's what we're starting to see around West Point and Army football. And you kind of started to talk about NIL, so we'll shift gears in the last couple minutes to talk about NIL and how that's a little bit different. I think clearly the revenue sharing had to happen. We're not going back. Their players are going to continue to get paid. I don't think it's going back the other direction. But I think most of us would agree that it's kind of the wild, wild west out there right now, and there probably need to be some guardrails so to speak, around what needs to happen in terms of the rules of how you can play players. I've heard of, some folks talk about it needs to be like an NFL collective bargaining type situation. There maybe needs to be salary caps, or there's a whole lot of stuff thrown out. Kennington, if you're the director of the NCAA, what type of guardrails would you like to see put in place, or how would you like to see NIL handled going forward?
Yeah, I think so the first thing, going back to the beginning of this episode, you said that it feels like NIL and transfer portal are lumped together. That probably would have been my first thing if we're going back in time. Not introducing NIL and the transfer portal at the same time without regulation would have been probably my first move, because what NIL is in practice and what is perceived to be are two different things. But when you introduce them at the same time, of you can pay players and now players have the ability to leave whatever college they're at and go somewhere else, that's where you get the pay for play from. And that's where it's kind of gone by the wayside. So that would have been my first thing. I do enjoy the idea of the revenue sharing, because at least it will level the playing field to a point where every university is going to have something to give. Now, the Alabamas, the Georgias, the Ohio States, they're going to have the most, obviously, but at least everybody will be able to pull from something. And that is going to be helpful. I think I probably would have implemented a salary cap or something to kind of make it a little bit more even across the sport, because ultimately, when we're having this conversation about NIL, my biggest gripe with it is that it is increasingly becoming more stressful and more expensive to be a fan of college football when you're having to pay for ticket sales and concessions and merchandise and parking and all the things that go into just going to and attending a game and supporting your team. And now you have athletic directors and an administration kind of breathing down your neck like, hey, we need X amount of dollars so we can pay this edge rusher. We need X amount of dollars per month so we can pay this star running back. And you're paying this money, and that player, again, might be here this semester and gone next semester. And it's kind of like now you're gonna have to
Yeah.
go and reinvest even more. You can go get the next running back and the next edge rusher. So it is increasingly becoming harder, more expensive to be a fan. I think bringing it in house of the university is going to make it more stressful for administrators. Obviously, they're going to have to make those tough decisions, but it's less of a burden on the fan themselves to shell out more money to support the team and to fund the team in a lot of these cases. So those would probably have been my main fixes, is not introducing them both at the same time. Implementing some guardrails on the front end. I think it's a little bit difficult now to kind of put the toothpaste back into the tube and go back regular on the back end. So I would have done more on the front end, but I do enjoy the idea of bringing it under the house of the university, to kind of have them make those decisions about who they're paying and how much and how they want to do, going through a third party and not being affiliated with the university, which can have its own issues of its own. And then obviously, the last part of it is the stress on the fans that it's going to take to fund $1 million rosters at the highest level. I feel like isn't the best way to continuously grow interest in the sport. If anything, is going to decrease interest in the sport if you're a fan of a high level school and you know that is going to cost a lot of money if you're really really a super fan into it to keep the team afloat.
Yeah, those are some really good points. It's funny, I never really thought of the financial impact on the fan base. That's a really good point that never really came up. I'm very thankful that Mike doesn't have to ask us to fund our quarterback or our running back. So that's a win.
So,
Other than my
so is
tax
Mike.
dollars,
Yeah.
we're good there. So Mike, obviously, again, with a different perspective, being the AD at Army, um, so we don't get to take advantage of NIL at all, which there's some positives too for sure. But what would you like to see change around NIL? I remember I was at the Florida Atlantic game, the first away game of the season, and right in the middle of their field, they have these big painted signs on the field, nilinparadise.com. I'm
Yeah.
like, they're right out there advertising it to all the recruits, everybody who's watching the game, how you can get NIL and go to school in Boca Raton and get to hang out on the beach. So, Mike, what would you change about it if you could?
Well, my biggest concern is, we have 30 sports, right? Kennington is following and embedded in one of the most storied football programs in the country, but not to put words in Greg Burns' mouth, but the way the athletic directors think is we've always had revenue sharing. We take the revenue from football, and that's how we fund our softball program and our baseball program and our tennis programs. And so now that revenue share is not going to go to them. It's going to go, I think 94% of it's going to go to football and basketball players. So what does that mean for those Olympic sports, and how do we make
Hmm.
up that delta? As Kennington pointed out, a lot of it's going to fall to the fan base, which I don't know how sustainable that is over a long period of time. And then, the incongruencies in it all for those of us who are just sitting at a distance, it doesn't seem right that we're saying 95% of the past revenue share or the house settlement back payments is going to go to football and basketball players. But the forward looking revenue share, if we're abiding by Title IX, is going to be 50-50 between female sports and male sports. I think the SEC and the Big Ten are taking 70% of the new college football revenue, but they're paying 20% of the house settlement. So I think the quicker that super conference is going to happen, that's going to happen, they will earn most of that revenue. But how do they figure out a way to not violate federal law with Title IX? It's interesting. At one of our AD meetings, they said, just pick the lawsuit you want. Pay the football players the rate that has already been identified, that they are 90% or whatever the percentage is. 90% of the revenue is brought in by them. So pay them the 90% and take the Title IX lawsuit. Or you can abide by Title IX, do it 50-50, and then get sued by the football players who have already been identified as bringing in 90% of the revenue. It's unfortunate. The amount of lawsuits is staggering. But at the end of the day, and Kennington used the word mobility early on, that's the net great outcome of this. These young men or women, if they don't like where they are, they have the mobility, they have the ability. And these diamonds in the rough that end up at a Mercer or Paul Skeens, who goes to Air Force to play baseball, if they blossom into a talent, they have the mobility and the ability to go somewhere else and get paid, in a lot of cases, a lot of money, because they're exceptional at what they do and they've earned that opportunity. So there's a lot of good, but there's just a lot of challenges, as Kennington pointed out. It wasn't rolled out probably as cleanly as it could have been,
Yeah.
but there's no going back now.
Yeah, I think Kennington, you made a really good point about rolling both of them out at once. I think caused a lot of chaos. It was funny, right? Because when the NIL was first mentioned, if you really look at, I guess, the definition of the word name, image, likeness, it was like, okay, if we use you in EA College Sports 25, you're going to get paid for that. Or if you're doing an ad for your local car dealership or whatever, you're going to get paid for that. The whole just directly paying people out of NIL collectives kind of spun off of that and changed it a lot for sure. Great discussion, guys. Really appreciate your time and your perspectives. I think, like you said, there's a lot that can be talked. We could probably talk about this topic for multiple hours, and I'm sure Mike in your AD meetings, this is always on the agenda, probably at every meeting you're at. As we go along and navigate through this, it'll be interesting to see the twists and turns that it makes, not only, as Mike pointed out, to the college football landscape, but to all the other college sports and Title IX and everything else. Lawsuits, player mobility. There's so many things and issues that kind of spin off of this. This will kind of be a continuing series that we'll talk about on GBK with different guests. Really making, I think the good thing about it is a lot of people thought it would ruin college football, and maybe long term it might, but this year's been pretty exciting and maybe I'm biased just because I'm a West Point grad, but this year's been pretty exciting and pretty cool to watch for a number of reasons. And it's interesting to see some of the unintended consequences that have occurred out of these two things, the transfer portal and NIL. It was funny. I was talking to an IT buddy of mine the second week of the season, and he said, as an IT guy, Joe, we always say, all right, if I make this change, and it solves one problem, what other problems does it cause? And I'm not sure that thought process was rolled out when NIL and portal both hit at the same time. So, Kennington, have fun at the Bama Mercer game this weekend, and thanks for joining us. And hope the dogs do well against Tennessee for sure. I'll be rooting for them. And Mike, enjoy the bye week. And Mike, real quick, give a quick little shout out promo. What other Army sports are going on this weekend that people can tune into?
Well, soccer season's just ended, but men and women's basketball, wrestling, and swimming are all getting going, and women's rugby's in the postseason semifinals. So, as always, plenty going on at West Point. Beat Navy.
Beat Navy. Thanks, guys.